seat. Well, welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Brit Vargas. I have the awesome opportunity to get to serve you guys here at Calvary, and it is such a blast to be able to actually wrap up our series. Like Pastor Aaron was saying prior, we're in a series currently called Family History, and basically what the heart behind this was the fact that when you say yes to Jesus, when you call yourself a follower of God, you get adopted into a family. And just like any other family, you kind of want to know who your relatives are. You want to know who you are and where you come from. And so the last couple weeks, we were looking at Caleb, Ruth, Josiah, and talking about strength and kindness and revival. And so today, we're going to continue on and kind of wrap up. Meeting our aunts and uncles of our Christian family. And so today, we're actually going to be looking at the book of Esther. I'm really excited to talk about Esther. One cool thing about Esther is the fact that it is one out of two books that are named after a woman. And as a woman of God, I love the fact that there are women in this Bible that just are so cool and have such interesting stories that we get tonight to look at one of them, which is Esther. And be forewarned, we are going through the whole book, but I won't be reading it. It's one of those stories where I, growing up in a Hispanic family, loved to watch with my grandmother telenovelas. And so the American version would be like Days of Our Lives. This story just reminds me so much of that moment. And so when we're looking at these stories, I love that we can look at through the lens of what it looks like to be an influence, what it means to have power of influence. And so today we are going to be looking at Esther in this story. But I just want to say something, preference this before we get started, is the fact that we can look at Bible characters. We could look at the biblical people in the Bible and just kind of write ourselves off. So you could either be like, you know what, that would happened 1,000 years ago. It's dusty, it's oldie. Like, it is overdone, we're over it. But I want us to really look at this and be like fresh new eyes and realizing that the Bible is so intense sometimes. And so we get to jump into some scriptures like that. But I also want us to realize the fact that we can look at the biblical characters in the stories and say, wow, that was an extraordinary story. That must mean that it is an extraordinary person, and that's not me. Like, you can be sitting here and already write yourself off. I'm not a woman, so I can't be like Esther. I'm not anything that have done anything great in my life or what I felt like I've done anything or accomplished anything, and so I can't be Esther. But I want us to stop realizing or thinking the fact that when we look at biblical characters in the Bible, we can say they're extraordinary, but they're regular, normal people. They're extraordinary simply because they serve an extraordinary God. That's what makes them extraordinary. Because if we look at the stats of Esther, so first of all, she was an exile, so that means she was an outcast, she was a nobody, she was actually seen beneath, not only for being a woman, but also being a Jew. Like, this was the moment where the Persian Empire during this story was in rule, and they had deemed anyone of Jewish culture less than. And so these Jews were scattered around Persia, outcasts, people who were unwanted where their homeland was. She was also an orphan. We see in Esther 2, the fact that she grew up and was raised by her uncle, Mordecai. But we can look at that as a fact that her family was broken. Like, she grew up without parents. I don't know if that's your story tonight, that you grew up in a single family home. But that was Esther, living from a broken family. She was also captive. Like, we'll see in the story that she becomes queen, spoiler alert. But the fact is, she's still under a rule of a king. She had no rights. She couldn't do how she wanted, how she pleased. She was captive. And yet, because of those things, it makes this story extraordinary because God uses her anyway in such powerful ways. And tonight, we're going to be looking at through the lens of the power of influence. So you might be thinking like, okay, I don't have a TikTok following over 1,000. No, I want us to realize that each one of us has this power. Basically, what influence means is that you are inspiring people. But the catch is, you're inspiring people to take action. Your inspiration produces things that people do, character traits, behavior. It changes people. That's what it means to have influence. And we're going to look at this story, and we're going to see two people who have the opportunity to step into moments of influence. And we're going to see two sides of the coin of the fact that how we use influence, whether it's a negative, manipulative way, or influence in a way that is having kingdom effect. The fact that what we do on this life has ramifications forever. When we talk about eternity, that literally means forever. I love this. In high school, I had a pastor who kind of wanted to give a visual of what forever looked like. And so he had everyone stand up and everyone stand in this long line, and we kind of had fingertips to fingertips. And then he said, okay, the person on the very end, could you point to your fingernail? And we're like, okay. And he's like, okay, imagine that fingernail is your life here on earth. And the rest of eternity is all of these people plus millions more. The life that we have here on earth is a sneeze. It is a quick blink of an eye in comparison to eternity, in comparison to forever. And so our challenge tonight is to look through this story through the lens of the power of influence and look at the fact that what we decide to do with our influence today has ripple effect forever. And so we get to see through Esther what it looks like to have eternal ramifications for the kingdom of God. So here's what we're going to do. If you have a Bible, whether it's on an app, you actually have the book. We're going to open it up to Esther, and we're going to start in chapter 1. But I'm just going to do a quick overview because, of course, we only have a few minutes together. But we are going to look at chapter 1. And chapter 1 is basically we meet this lady named Vashti. And you're like, who, what? This was the lady who was queen. And she was married to the king Ahasuerus. Okay, and so what happened was the king decided to have a party for 7 days. Now, let me tell you something. After Cultivate, I was tired. I'm still tired from Cultivate. So it couldn't matter partying for 7 whole days and then deciding to make choices. And so the king had been partying for 7 days and decided that, you know what? I want to use my wife to entertain people. And as a woman, I read this and I was like, excuse me, what? And of course, Vashti, she had this similar reaction. She was like, no, that's not what I want to do. And so the king became nervous because he was like, well, she can't respond to me in that way because you know what? If the rest of the women find out, they're going to think that they can do that and dishonor their husbands too. So I need to make an example of her. So what he decides to do is just get rid of her. And so because he now has no queen, he's in need of a queen, right? And so then we get into chapter 2, and this is the moment where Esther comes into the story. She is a nobody. Again, she's a Jew. And so when the king asks for all the eligible ladies to come in and to see if they were queen, Esther walks in and she gains favor, it says. She gains favor with not only the king, but the people around her. And the catch is they don't know that she's a Jew. They don't know that she has something to hide, really. So we meet Esther. She's been thrown into this because she couldn't say no to the king, right? She could have, but that probably would have equaled her life. And so she's forced into this moment of captivity. And I could only imagine how frustrating that looked. how frustrating that would have felt. So she is queen. But remember, the king, he has all the cards. So we're going to actually jump into chapter 3, verse 1. It says, after all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff of the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to him, because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai, who would not bow down or pay homage, the members of the royal staff and the king's gate asked Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? When they had warned him day after day, and he still would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's action would be tolerated, since he had told them he was a Jew. Again, remember, he's an outcast. So when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down and paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, although Ahasuerus' kingdom. So here is the angst of the story. This is the setup of the story. So basically, Haman, if you ever think of that movie, Aladdin, right? We have the Sultan, the guy who's apparently running stuff, but then there's like this second in command guy, Jafar, but he's really like up to no good, and he's just running it like just through a lot of manipulation. That's Haman. That's Haman to the king. Like he is a guy who's just been set up with a lot of honor by the king. And then he sees one guy, Mordecai, and remember, Mordecai is Esther's uncle. And he sees him not bowing down to him. So what does it do? It enrages him. And so this is how we start the manipulation of Haman. And I want you to notice, because the influence of Haman versus Esther is astoundingly opposite. Verse 8 says, then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, this is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn by authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for deposit into the royal treasury. So you see here, Haman, he has his influence of position to the king. And so he's deciding, because Mordecai won't bow down to him, he's just gonna take all the Jews out. He's like, that's gonna solve my problems. I'll just get rid of them all, including Mordecai. And so it's like that moment where he's like, he's not doing what I'm saying. I'm gonna go tell the teacher. Like that's literally what he's doing to the king. He's like, excuse me, do you not know that there's these people group? They're scattered around. And it's in your best interest. He's making it the king's best interest. The fact that he needs to deal with these people, and the only way to deal with them is by destroying them. And so we see Haman is using his power of influence to simply manipulate, to self-serve. Verse 11 says, this is what the king said. The king told Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with as you see fit. The royal scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded. Haman's running the show. Like literally, he brought him a problem, and the king was like, cool, dude, trust ya. Get it going. And then we see, we're gonna fast forward a little bit, we see that Haman is acting out of anger and acting out of self-worship. Like he thinks that he needs to be honored, he needs to be feared and respected so much that people need to die if they don't follow the rules. And so then this decree is sent out everywhere. And so when it reaches Mordecai's ears, he literally is so distraught, he tears his clothes. Like I could imagine there's a moment in your life where you have just gotten to the rock bottom and then just something else happens and you just lose it. Like this is the moment that Mordecai is suffering through. And so what this story, what this whole book of Esther does is it kind of flips through different characters and what they're being up to. And so this is all happening. So Mordecai does this like Harry Potter move where he decides to send, instead of an owl, it's a human. He decides to send someone to relay a message to Esther, being like, excuse me, look what's happening. Like this is the moment that we need to do something. Chapter 4, verse 10 says, Esther spoke to Hatshepsut, which is like the messenger guy, and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who had not been summoned, the death penalty. Unless the king extends the golden scepter, allowing that person to live, I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Could you imagine being a wife and you haven't even seen your husband in 30 days because you haven't been summoned? So she's telling Mordecai, are you kidding me? I haven't been summoned, and you know what happens if I go to the king and I haven't been summoned? Like the one law that affects everyone is that I would be put to death. And I love the faith of Mordecai because he literally then immediately sends a message back to Esther. In verse 12, this was his response. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you've been come to your royal position at such a time for this. Mordecai's looking at Esther and saying, I get it. But could you just imagine that God was intentional to choose you to have favor with the king, choose you, a Jew, to be the queen for just a time for this? Maybe you have been chosen for a moment, exactly all your quirks, all your challenges, everything that you've gone through for just a time for this. I love the faithfulness because he looks at her and says, there's danger if nothing is done. Why can't you continue to be faithful for just a time for this? And this is the moment that Esther realized, like, she has been called. This is the moment. Verse 15, it says, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him to. This is the moment that Esther has made a decision. This was the deciding, distinguishing moment for her. But I love the fact that she doesn't just jet off to the first thing. Like, she doesn't take that first step without what? Fasting. Without looking to God to what he has to say in this moment. Like, she didn't go out running and like take a horse and just head off to the kingdom. No, she literally said, you know what? I know this is important, but it's more important if we fast and we pray about it. I love the fact that she takes note of that. That's her very first bold step into stepping into this defining moment. And so after 3 days, she then, in chapter 5, she will go and address the king. Verse 1, it says, on the third day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing it. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom, facing its entrance. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she gained favor with him. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand towards Esther, and she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What is it, Queen Esther? The king asked her. Whatever you want, even half the kingdom will be given to you. If it pleases the king, Esther replied, may the king and Haman come today for a banquet I have prepared for them. The king said, hurry and get Haman so we can do as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. While drinking the wine, the king asked Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you want, even half the kingdom will be done. Esther answered, this is my petition. This is my request. Now, if I was in Esther's shoes right now, I'd know what I'd be requesting. I know what I'd be asking for. And I'd be like, excuse me, do you know about my people? Do you know who I am? You're destroying them. But I want us to really look at verse 8 because this is her response. I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant me my petition and perform my request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet I prepare for them. Tomorrow, I will do what the king has asked. That day, Haman left full of joy and good spirits. So literally, he's like, you could have half the kingdom. What do you want? And she goes, I would like to have a banquet with you and Haman. She's already at one. Like, what? This is the moment where I was like, Esther, you're missing it. Like, this was your moment. You know, like the moment you're supposed to like do what you were supposed to do and like the whole reason why you're there. And yet she asked to do this. She asked for them to come and be with her in a banquet. And so you see, this is the moment like where Haman's like, ha ha ha, all my manipulation, I'm getting away with it. So he goes off to go gossip with his friends. And literally this is the moment where he's like, this is great. Me, the king, and the queen and I were like, this. And then he realizes, he remembers Mordecai. And he goes, yeah, but there's that one guy, Mordecai, the worst. He wouldn't bow down to me. And of course, his friends being like, yeah, Mordecai. They're like, okay, well, what if you like build a gallows so you can hang him on it? Then that will solve all your problems. And of course, Haman, in all the pride that he has, was like, perfect. I will send my servants. They will build gallows for him to be hung. And then he was like, okay, cool. And then he jets off. He's like, I need to be in the presence of the king and queen, so see you later. So literally, then we get into chapter 6. And we love it because we flip back to the king. And it's kind of one of those transitions where like, okay, that's what happened in Haman's world. Now what is happening in the king's world? And so what is happening is literally he's having those one night where he can't sleep. So he's like, what do I do? Servant, bring me the records and just read them to me so I can fall asleep. And so this is literally just the records of things that have happened to him, for him, all the things. And so in chapter 2, what happened was that there was a moment where there's 2 guards he had that decided that they had enough of the king and were just gonna like be done with him. Like, this is dramatic. They're like, you know what, we don't like him. Let's get rid of him, take it over, we'll be done. But what happened was Mordecai overheard this and told Esther, who told the king. And so while he's like laying there trying to sleep, he remembers, he's given remembrance of what had happened. And he's like, wait, who was that again? And they're like, Mordecai. And so then he's like, you know what? I need to honor him. So Haman comes in and he's like, Haman, what would you do if you were going to honor someone? If you were in my place and you were going to honor someone, what would you do? Just want to know your thoughts. And this is what Haman told him. He said, for the man the king wants to honor, this is verse 7. Verse 8, have them bring the royal garment that the king himself has worn and a horse the king himself has ridden, which has the royal crown on its head. Put the garment and the horse under the charge of one of the king's most noble officials. Then have them clothe the man the king wants to honor, parade him on a horse throughout the city square, and call out before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. And then it goes on and it's like, he's saying all these things because he thinks it's him. And so when the king hears that, he's like, that's a good idea. Well, Haman, could you do that for Mordecai? Haman's like, what? He's like, yeah, the way that you were going to roll everything out, could you do that for Mordecai? So if you can only imagine how enraged Haman has now become, because literally what he thought he deserved, he's giving to Mordecai, who he just built things to hang and destroy his people. And so he does this. because the king asked him to. And of course, the king has that kind of rule. And we look at chapter 7, verse 1. We come to the banquet. So that has passed. Haman is outraged as all. And so Esther has invited Haman and the king to another banquet. Verse 1, it says, the king and Haman came to feast with Esther the queen. Once again, on the second day, while drinking wine, the king asked Esther, Queen Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you seek, even to half the kingdom, will be done. Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if the king is pleased, spare my life, this is my request. And spare my people, this is my desire. For my people and I have been sold to destruction, death, and annihilation. If we were merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent. Indeed, the trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. King Ahasuerus spoke up and asked Queen Esther, who is this, and where is the one who would devise such a scheme? This is where she comes. Again, she has favor with the king. Verse 6, Esther answered, the adversary and enemy is the evil Haman. Haman stood terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in anger and went from where they were drinking wine to the palace garden. Haman remained to beg Queen Esther for his life because he realized the king was planning something terrible for him. Like, this is the moment where Haman's like, shoot, messed up. Like literally, Esther has all the favor and influence over the king to the fact that she literally unveils the schemes of the second in command, and it angers the king. It inspires the king to take action, because this is what happens. Chapter 8, verse 1, it says the same day, so literally, same day response, King Ahasuerus awarded Queen Esther the estate of Haman and the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai entered the king's presence because Esther had revealed her relationship to Mordecai. So she literally was like, this is my uncle. The king removed his signet ring he had recovered from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put him in charge of Haman's estate. Then Esther addressed the king again. She fell at his feet, wept, and begged him to revoke the evil of Haman the Agagite and his plot he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter towards Esther, so she got up and stood before the king. She said, if it pleases the king and I have found favor with him, if the matter seems right to the king and I am pleasing in his eyes, let the royal edict be written. Let it revoke the documents the scheming Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how could I bear to see the disaster that would come on my people? How could I bear to see the destruction of my relatives? King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, look, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows because he attacked the Jews. Write in the king's name whatever pleases you concerning the Jews and seal it with the royal signet, a document written in the king's name and sealed with the royal signet ring cannot be revoked. So what happens is the gallows that were meant for Mordecai ended up being the demise for Haman. Like the manipulation and the influence that he was using to serve himself becomes his ultimate destruction. And so I want us to look at the influence that Esther had, that she had the power of influence to literally turn a catastrophe into a miracle. Like this literally was a moment that the whole entire Jewish nation could have been wiped out. Yet Esther was able to gain favor and gain the influence of a king to be able to save her people. And I love it because we can look at three things. We can recognize three things when using the power of influences in Esther's stories. She looked at the timing. Like remember in the verses where she heard the news and she decided that she was gonna take this bold step, this defining moment, and step into it with courage. And so she decided to what? Fast and pray. She decided to stop and ask Jesus. Stop to ask God, what would you have for me in this moment? And then she continues on with the timing of God because she invites the king and Haman into a banquet. And then the king is literally saying, well, what do you want? You literally could have anything you want. And yet she invites him again to another banquet. And that's only then when she was able to ask what she really desired and wanted from the king. And I think it's important for us to realize that she didn't rush into this, because if she would have, God, what he was doing in the background could have been short-circuited. Like the bad things that Haman was up to, the manipulation wouldn't have lined up in the way that God had entailed it to. So it's important that Esther was looking at the timing of the way that she interacted with the king and the way that she asked and influenced the king. The second thing is her manner. Notice every time she talked to the king, it wasn't talking down to him. It wasn't a moment where she just like busted open and was like, you know what? You're doing something wrong. Get it together. No, she had the respect and had the understanding of who he was. She had the understanding of how she was supposed to act. She had the understanding and the respect, but she also had the understanding of the danger. She had the understanding of the danger of what would happen if she went to the king unsummoned. But she also knew the danger of if she didn't go to the king, what would happen to her people, what would happen to her. So not only was she looking at the timing, she was looking at the manner, but then also the third thing is she was looking at the setting. She created a banquet, right? 2 banquets, in fact. She created a space for there to be openness and understanding. She created a space and the opportunity to be heard. She had empathy. She had a moment where she knew what the lens of the other characters, the king and Haman, had, and she used that to further her influence. And so we can look at Esther and be like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like, we can look at it and be like, but that was a long time ago, Brit. So what does that influence look like today? Because we all have the power to influence people, negative and positive, to self-serve yourself or to glorify the kingdom. We all contain this gift. Like, literally, if we look at Genesis 1:28, it literally asks Adam and Eve, commanded both of them to rule the earth and subdue it. What does that mean? It literally means we are equipped with a unique power to accomplish his mandate. We're equipped with this unique power to walk out God's mandate. We're equipped with this power to do his will, and that is the confidence we get to walk in. That is the confidence that we get to influence people in. And so for us, when we now reflect our own selves, our own lives, if we look at these 3 things of influence, the timing, when you have a moment, an opportunity to step into a moment of influence, are you going before God intentionally before? Because I truly know that if you were to bring this before God, that he would have a moment to either encourage you in it or call you out. In order for us to know that if it's to influence for God's glory or our glory, is if we really honestly bring it to God prior to that. Again, looking at the manner, are we respecting and understanding the situations that we're walking into? Are we expecting people just to know it all? Like, I can imagine if you were not a Christian, did not grow up in the Christian home or going to church, and you walked in through these doors, and we all of a sudden, in the beginning of service, just stand up and sing. Like, how weird would that be? Like, if you had no context. So when we influence people, we have to realize that sometimes they don't have the same context, the same lens as we do. So understanding the manner and when and how we influence. The last thing is the setting. Are you creating space for openness? Like, when we want to manipulate and influence people in a negative way, we're gonna do it as quick as we can. Like you saw Haman, as quick as we can, because we want what we want. But when we get to influence through this power on behalf of God, it's in his timing. And sometimes maybe that takes a long time. Like we talk about this a lot, discipleship. And that might seem like a fancy Christian word, but literally it just means to do life. It literally means that we do life with other people. I know that my roommates and we will do discipleship. Last week, we went to the grocery store together. I was so filled. We had a blast. We went to Ralph's, and we just looked at all the things, got excited over all the items. It was great. And maybe that's just speaking my age. But that's discipleship. And because we do things like that, there's moments where we have this openness, this setting, where if one of us needs to be encouraged, if one of us needs to be challenged, we're more open to hearing that. And so when we influence people, we gotta consider the timing, the manner, and the setting. But beyond all of it, beyond it all, we need to know that God is the ultimate influencer. He's top notch. He's the reason why we get to have this gift. We get to be in these opportunities. We get to step into these defining moments is literally because God is the influencer. We are merely just the tools of God that are invited into these moments. We can look at Esther, and when Mordecai was telling her of the tragedy of what was gonna happen to her and her people, and she decided that she thought at first that it would be too much of a cost to go to the king. He literally tells her this: if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. Mordecai is walking in the influence in influencing Esther in this confidence because he knows that his God is faithful. He says, if it's not through you, it's gonna be through somebody else, but your family is going to pay for it. And so Mordecai, what he's inviting Esther into this moment of opportunity is to influence the king to realize that she's been placed with all the quirks of herself, with all the things that makes her who she is, for this moment, to influence a king that can save people. And maybe that sounds like, whoa, I don't have that opportunity to save a whole people. But no, we do get invited into these moments. We do get invited into these moments that are defining, that we get to step into. We get invited in to be tools of God's influence and his power. And so these defining moments, we need to understand the influence of power. We need to be aware of those moments because they could be just passing by. You might be sitting here and being like, I know exactly what she's talking about. Or you might be like, I have no clue. But know that every single one of us is invited into using this power, this gift of influencing for kingdom glory. And so we can walk in God's confidence that he walks with us, he walks before us in this. And we are simply the mouthpieces of God. We're simply being at the mercy of God because God does the heavy lifting. God is the one who influences people. God is the one who saves them. So maybe for you that you're being called to be an influencer in this ministry. Maybe you have been standing here in this worship center since January, and you want to worship God with all you've got, but you're afraid of that person and what they're going to think about you. That's the enemy. Maybe this is your moment, your defining moment that you get to step into and be an influence of our worship culture. Maybe it's in your school. I know school looks real weird right now, but you know what? There's still moments where you can influence people in the way that you treat your teachers, in the way that you're diligent in your work. Maybe it's your family. Can I just be honest right now? There's a prayer that I've been praying for probably 20 years that has to do with my family. And there are moments where my heart is really hard because I don't think that God's gonna move it. He hasn't done it yet, so he's not gonna do it. But can I tell you that when I read the book of Esther, it got me hard. It got me to the fact to call me higher, and the fact that maybe God was asking me to be an influence in my family. Maybe he was asking me into this defined moment to be a tool for God. I don't have to walk around with the burden of the fact that I need to save my family. Maybe you come from a family where you're the only Christian. You're the only one. And can I release you of that burden? You don't have to carry that burden alone. Small group is a moment that you get to do life, discipleship together with people. But know that you don't do the heavy lifting. Remember, who does? God. God is the one who influences people. But maybe he's inviting you to be the tool for him. Maybe it's your friend group. I'm going to invite the band up. And I want us to really, we could walk away and be like, Brit said some cool things about Esther. No, I really want you to reflect on the fact that there is somebody in your life. Maybe it's a group of people, maybe it's one person, maybe it's a sibling. That God is inviting you into this defining moment to influence them, to have eternal ramifications. I know, and it's so cool to hear your guys' stories. I got to hear and talk to some of you guys at Cultivate, and the way that you're getting to serve your family, your friends, and know that there are people in heaven you will see that because you decided to boldly step out in this power of influence for God, that they're gonna be there too. And so we can't blame the fact that we're just normal people, because you know what? Remember, Esther was an orphan, she was an outcast, she was captive, she was under the thumb of a ruler, and yet because she decided to surrender to the fact that the power that God has given her to influence other people for his glory, nothing can be stopped. And so my challenge to you is to really spend some time, maybe it's with your small group, with your friends. What areas of influence do you have? Everyone has them. It doesn't mean that it's a large one, because you know what? God cares about the one. And then also, what is a defining moment that you've been invited into that you've said no, or you said not yet, but you feel in your heart that God's saying, but I want to use you? What is that defining moment? Or if you haven't thought of one yet, what is that defining moment that you need to step into or become aware? Maybe it's spending time with God and saying, Lord, will you give me a spirit that is sensitive to becoming aware of where I need to be an influence for you? And so those are my challenges for you. We're gonna pray in just a second, but I want you to lean into that fact that Esther was like a nobody, but yet was able to do extraordinary things because she served an extraordinary God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you're a God who is true to your character, Lord, that you are a God who meets us wherever we're at. So Lord, I ask, would you give us spirits that want to influence for your glory, that want to be tools used by you, Lord, because we walk in your confidence. Lord, so I ask, would you give us boldness in our hearts? Would you give us awareness in where we need to become the light, Lord, become the salt of the earth? Lord, I ask, would you make it clear to us today, Lord, would we spend the next moments aware of your presence? We thank you so much, and we praise your name. We pray this in your precious name. Amen.